The first sound I heard beneath the floorboards was not scratching. It was breathing, slow and wet, like something enormous had been sleeping directly beneath my bed for a very long time. When I leaned closer to the wooden floor, the breathing suddenly stopped, and a voice whispered my name from the darkness below. I froze beside the bed, while every muscle in my body locked with fear. The voice sounded almost human, but there was something wrong with the way it stretched each syllable, like it was learning how to speak for the first time. Then 3 loud knocks echoed beneath the floorboards directly under my feet. I should explain why I was even inside that cabin to begin with. 2 weeks earlier, my grandfather died unexpectedly and left me ownership of a century-old property buried deep in the desert, miles away from the nearest town. Nobody in my family had spoken about the place for years, and honestly, I never even knew it existed until the lawyer handed me the documents. The drive to the cabin took nearly 6 hours, through endless empty highways surrounded by dead desert land. Rusted signs leaned sideways in the sand, while dry wind dragged dust across the road, like smoke from a distant fire. By the time I finally reached the property, the sun was sinking behind the mountains, and the entire desert glowed blood-red beneath the evening sky. The cabin looked ancient, far older than anything still standing should have been. The wooden walls sagged inward, while cracked windows reflected the dying sunlight like black mirrors staring back at me. Strange symbols had been carved into nearly every support beam surrounding the porch, though most were too faded to recognize clearly. The moment I stepped inside, a terrible smell hit me hard enough to make my stomach twist. It smelled like rotting wood mixed with damp earth and something metallic hiding underneath it all. Every floorboard creaked beneath my weight, as if the cabin itself was struggling to stay standing after decades of neglect. I spent the first few hours unpacking supplies and trying to convince myself the place only felt disturbing because it had been abandoned for so long. My grandfather had apparently planned to restore the property before he died, which explained the old tools, fuel containers, and stacks of repair materials scattered around the cabin. Still, something about the atmosphere inside felt deeply wrong in a way I could not explain. As darkness swallowed the desert outside, the temperature dropped sharply enough to frost the cabin windows. I sat beside an oil lantern, reading through old property documents, when I heard the first scratching sound beneath the floor. At first, I assumed rats or coyotes had gotten trapped under the structure, but the movement sounded far too heavy and deliberate. The scratching traveled slowly from one side of the room to the other, directly beneath my chair. Then it stopped completely before 3 loud knocks echoed beneath the floorboards. I remember staring at the wood beneath my boots while a horrible realization settled into my chest, because those knocks sounded intentional. That night I barely slept, because the sounds continued until sunrise. Every few hours something crawled slowly beneath the cabin, while distant whispers drifted through the walls like voices carried by the wind. By morning, I noticed long claw marks carved into the wooden floor beside my bed that definitely had not been there before. The nearest town sat nearly 40 minutes away from the cabin, along a cracked desert road. It looked half abandoned, with faded storefronts and exhausted people who avoided eye contact whenever possible. The moment I mentioned my grandfather's name inside the local diner, the entire room fell silent. An older waitress carrying a coffee pot stopped dead beside my table when I told her where I was staying. Her face lost all color, while several people quietly stood up and walked toward the exit without saying a word. Before leaving, she leaned close enough for me to smell cigarette smoke on her clothes and whispered that I needed to leave the desert before nightfall. Naturally, I asked her why everyone seemed terrified of the cabin. She hesitated for several seconds while glancing nervously toward the diner windows, like someone outside might be listening. Finally, she told me people had been disappearing near that property for nearly 50 years. According to her, strange sounds often echoed across the desert around the cabin after midnight. Travelers reported hearing voices calling for help from beneath the ground, though nobody could ever explain where the voices came from. Most disturbing of all, several missing people had supposedly been last seen walking toward the property willingly, as if something had lured them there. I tried convincing myself the stories were only local legends, designed to scare outsiders away from abandoned land. Even so, the waitress's warning stayed buried in my thoughts during the drive back through the desert. The closer I got to the cabin, the heavier the silence around me seemed to become. When I stepped back inside the property, every chair in the cabin had been moved into a perfect circle around the center of the room. Fresh dirt covered the wooden floor between them, while dark footprints led toward the bedroom before suddenly disappearing. That was the exact moment I heard breathing beneath the floorboards for the first time. The sound came directly from under my bed, slow and deep like lungs pulling air through water. I knelt beside the floor and pressed my ear against the wood while my pulse hammered violently inside my chest. For several seconds, everything went completely silent before a voice whispered my name inches beneath me. I stumbled backward hard enough to slam against the wall behind me. The voice sounded familiar somehow, almost like my grandfather speaking through layers of dirt and water. Then the scratching returned louder than before, moving slowly beneath the entire cabin, while the walls groaned around me. I should have left that night, but curiosity is a dangerous thing when fear mixes with unanswered questions. Instead of packing my truck, I spent the evening searching the cabin for anything connected to my grandfather. Eventually, I found an old locked chest hidden beneath a tarp in the storage room. Inside were dozens of journals, photographs, and cassette tapes, wrapped carefully in stained cloth. Most of the journals belonged to my grandfather and described strange events surrounding the property dating back decades. The deeper I read, the more obvious it became that he believed something was living beneath the cabin. One journal entry described hearing voices beneath the floor that perfectly mimicked dead relatives. Another mentioned violent scratching sounds coming from underground tunnels hidden somewhere beneath the property. Near the final pages, my grandfather repeatedly apologized to someone named Elias, while warning that the creature was becoming hungry again. That sentence kept replaying inside my head, while darkness settled over the desert for the second night. Around midnight, the scratching beneath the cabin became violent enough to shake the furniture. Dust drifted from the ceiling, while distant whispering echoed through the walls surrounding me. Then the floorboards beneath the kitchen suddenly lifted upward several inches before slamming back down violently. I grabbed my lantern and rushed toward the noise while my hands trembled uncontrollably. Beneath a loose section of flooring, I discovered a rusted metal hatch hidden under years of dust. The hatch had been sealed with several heavy locks covered in faded symbols, matching the carvings outside the cabin. Most terrifying of all, the locks had recently been broken open from the inside. Fresh claw marks surrounded the metal edges, like something had desperately tried forcing its way upward. At that point, I genuinely did not know what to do. If you had discovered a hidden hatch beneath an abandoned cabin, while something breathed underneath you all night, would you have opened it or run away forever? I wish more than anything that I had left the desert before seeing what waited below. Instead, I pried the hatch open with a crowbar while the lantern flickered beside me. A terrible smell poured upward from the darkness beneath the cabin, carrying the scent of decay and wet earth, despite the dryness of the surrounding desert. Narrow wooden stairs descended deep underground beyond the reach of my lantern light. The tunnel beneath the cabin stretched far deeper than it should have. Ancient wooden beams supported the walls, while strange symbols covered nearly every surface in dark paint that looked disturbingly similar to dried blood. About 20 feet underground, I discovered dozens of cassette tapes stacked beside an old recorder. Most of the recordings were damaged beyond repair, but a few still worked. The voices belonged to previous owners of the cabin, each describing scratching sounds beneath the floor before descending into panic and screaming. One recording ended with a man begging something underground to stop imitating his daughter's voice. The final tape belonged to my grandfather. His voice sounded exhausted and terrified, while violent scratching echoed around him in the background. He repeatedly apologized for feeding innocent people to whatever lived beneath the desert, because he believed it was the only way to keep the surrounding towns safe. The recording ended after a loud crash shook the room around him. Seconds later, I heard him screaming while something copied his voice perfectly through the static. Then the tape cut off completely, leaving only silence inside the underground tunnel. I continued deeper beneath the property, despite every instinct begging me to turn back. The tunnel eventually opened into massive underground chambers hidden directly beneath the desert floor. Candles, bones, and rotting furniture filled the rooms, while faded photographs of missing people covered the walls. Every photograph showed my grandfather standing somewhere nearby, watching silently in the background. Beneath the pictures, I found journals describing a forgotten cult formed by early settlers decades earlier. According to the writings, something ancient had been discovered sleeping beneath the desert long before the cabin was built. The settlers believed the creature could manipulate thoughts and imitate human voices perfectly. They fed travelers and missing people to the entity in exchange for protection from drought, disease, and violent storms. Over time, the cabin became a prison designed to contain the creature underground, while rituals kept it weak. My grandfather eventually inherited responsibility for maintaining those rituals after the cult disappeared. When the sacrifices stopped, however, the creature beneath the cabin slowly began growing stronger again. The journals repeatedly warned that someone from our bloodline would eventually need to finish what the cult started. The deeper I traveled underground, the louder the whispering became around me. Voices from my childhood drifted through the darkness, calling my name softly from beyond the lantern light. Sometimes I heard my mother crying somewhere nearby, even though she had died nearly 15 years earlier. Eventually, the tunnel opened into a massive underground pit hidden directly beneath the cabin itself. Human skeletons covered the sand surrounding the hole, while enormous claw marks scarred the stone walls around it. Thick wooden beams reinforced the ceiling overhead, like the supports of a giant cage. Something moved inside that pit while I stood frozen near the edge. Bones cracked loudly beneath the darkness, before two pale, human-like arms slowly reached upward into the lantern glow. Then dozens of voices whispered my name simultaneously from below. Before I could react, the entire underground chamber shook violently as a sandstorm exploded across the desert above. Wooden beams snapped apart while deafening screams echoed from inside the pit. I watched in horror as something enormous started climbing upward, using limbs bent at impossible angles. The creature looked vaguely human, only in the worst possible ways. Its skin stretched tightly across an unnaturally thin body, while dozens of mouths opened and closed randomly along its chest and neck. Every mouth spoke with the voices of missing people whose photographs I had seen upstairs. I turned and ran through the collapsing tunnels, while the creature chased me through the darkness beneath the cabin. The whispers behind me transformed into desperate screaming, while dirt and debris rained from the ceiling overhead. Several times I heard the creature perfectly mimic my grandfather's voice, begging me to stop running. When I finally burst back into the cabin, the floorboards exploded upward behind me. The creature dragged itself partially into the room, while black liquid poured from its twisting body across the wooden floor. Lightning flashed through shattered windows, revealing human faces moving beneath its skin like trapped souls trying to escape. I grabbed the lantern from the table and threw it against the wall beside the creature. Flames spread instantly across the dry wooden interior, while violent shrieks shook the entire structure around me. The thing beneath the floor retreated, screaming back underground as the cabin became consumed by fire. I barely escaped the property before the entire structure collapsed inward. From outside, I watched flames disappear into the underground tunnels, while the sandstorm swallowed the burning ruins beneath clouds of dust. Just before the fire vanished completely, I heard my grandfather whisper my name beneath the desert one final time. Authorities never found evidence supporting my story after the fire died out days later. The underground tunnels collapsed completely, while shifting sand buried most of the ruins. Everyone assumed grief and exhaustion had caused me to hallucinate the entire experience. For months I tried convincing myself they were right. I moved across the country, avoided discussing the cabin, and attempted rebuilding a normal life far away from the desert. Unfortunately, the nightmares followed me everywhere I went. Sometimes I wake in the middle of the night, hearing slow scratching beneath my apartment floor. Other times I hear familiar voices whispering softly through the walls, while nobody else notices anything unusual. The worst nights are when I hear breathing directly beneath my bed again. A few weeks ago, I received an unmarked package containing one of my grandfather's old cassette tapes. There was no return address, and nobody could explain how it reached my apartment. When I finally played the recording, I immediately recognized the sound of scratching beneath wooden floorboards. Then I heard my own voice speaking calmly through the static. It warned me that the cabin had never been a prison for the creature at all. According to the voice on the tape, the cabin was only a door waiting for someone from my bloodline to open it again. I still have not listened to the rest of the recording. Every night the scratching beneath my apartment grows louder while the floorboards beneath my bed rise slightly upward in the darkness. Deep down, I know something followed me out of that desert, and I think it is finally close enough to crawl back into the light. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like this video, subscribe to Grave Nova Stories, and share your thoughts in the comments below. I'll see you in the next nightmare.